First of all, thank you very much to Democracy International and Akuns for organizing and hosting this meeting here in Vienna. I very much applaud this initiative of the Democracy Rally, Danube region. And it's also a big pleasure to speak here in Vienna, since after all, we have to recall that Austria-Hungary and here Vienna was the seat of probably the first multi-ethnical and multinational parliament in human history, I guess. So I will be talking about this topic of transnationalism and parliamentarism a lot, specifically the establishment of the UN Parliamentary Assembly, a topic that I've been working on for the last 15 years probably, and in 2007 I was among a group of people and parliamentarians, civil society organizations who established the international campaign for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. It is important, in my view, to put the issue of the Parliamentary Assembly and the democratization of the United Nations into a broader context. And that's why I believe the first intervention here was quite useful, because it opened the spectrum of what problems exist in democracy and in the international order. However, I would like to stress first that it is a remarkable trend. I mean, the most remarkable characteristic of the 20th century is probably the rise of democracy. At the beginning of the century, in 1900, there was not a single country in the entire world that we would today consider a democracy. We didn't even have women's suffrage, you must imagine. So at that point, there was not a single country in the entire world being a democracy. And in 1950, after the Second World War, 1/3 of the world population resided in 22 democratic countries. And today, it's 2/3, around between 60 to 66% of the world population do live in around 120 of 193 democratic countries. Considered democratic, I mean, that's of course a matter of, controversial. It's controversial what is a democracy and what's not. But the number I'm using is from a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., so we can be pretty sure that we are on the safe side saying this. We will take questions later, I guess. So that is an extremely important trend, to see democracy is gaining ground in the world, and this trend is continuing. And we have to see that in all world regions, even in countries like China and the Near East or anywhere else, if we look at opinion polls that have been conducted in the last decade, since the 60s around, you can see that there is a firm support for democratic governance as mode of government, as ideal mode of government, as form of government. There are even, polls that show more support than 90% in the, it's an overwhelming support for democracy. However, we should not make the mistake and believe that this means satisfaction, because it does not. We will be talking about the democratic deficit at the United Nations. And what does democratic deficit mean? That's the wide gap and widening gap between the expectations of the citizens, what democracy should deliver and how it performs, and what they actually get from the system. So if some scholars and writers are talking about postmodern, post-democratic era, I don't agree. I would say, although we are moving into that direction, this does not mean, it should not be confused with the idea that support for democracy is eroding, because it's not. Quite the contrary. Support for democracy is growing in the world, and it is continuing to do so. However, we have to see that this trend towards democracy in the world is just one side of the coin. This reference to postmodern, post-democratic era, that means that we are indeed in a phase where democracy is strongly endangered by globalizing forces, which means that more and more issues, political problems have to be dealt with and are being dealt with at the global level in intergovernmental organizations. However, the problem is that democratic institutions are still, if I can put it that way, they are still in the cage of the nation state. You see, we have national democratic institutions, we have experience at the national level, however, we don't have that at the intergovernmental level. By definition, intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, whatever. Those organizations are by definition intergovernmental. What does that mean? That means, first of all, that one country has one vote, principally in the International Monetary Fund it's a bit different, but the population of a country is represented by the executive branch of the government, which is nominally one person, one representative. It means that opposition forces, like you would have in a parliament, they are automatically excluded. You see, in a national parliament, you would have a spectrum of political voices, opposition, you would have a governing majority, you would have a minority, who are engaged in a mechanism that creates accountability. You do not have that at the UN, you don't have that at the World Bank or anywhere else, because it's the executive branches who meet there. And this is, in my opinion, the biggest source of a democratic deficit. Because we as the people, the citizens, we have no opportunity to be involved in this process. And it's even worse if you look at intergovernmental negotiations, which are often carried out in secret. We've seen that, for example, some of you might remember the efforts for a multilateral agreement on investments undertaken by the OECD in the 90s. We had the same thing going on with the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement that was rejected, thankfully, by the European Parliament. A very important development. And we are now seeing the very same thing with the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership or the Trans-Pacific Partnership that are being negotiated. And interestingly, and this indeed does support the idea of post-democratic order, interestingly, multinational corporations are actively invited to comment on drafts, to be part of the negotiations, and by contrast, popularly elected representatives, like in the European Parliament or national parliament, they are excluded. They have to fight for actually getting drafts. And this is an imbalance that is totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap that we can see between, what we have as an experience at the national level and what we see at the international level going on? And my reply at this stage would be, well, we have to look at closely what we have at the national level, not extrapolate it, but learn from this. And the bottom line is that there is no democracy without parliamentary representation. I totally agree. Democracy is much more than elections. Democracy is a very, broad cultural, a broad cultural matter. However, if you look at it institutionally, I am convinced you cannot create a democracy without having political representation and votes. And actually, even 20 years ago, there was already the debate that there is a right to democratic governance. And Alfred de Sayers already quoted Article 25 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which says, and I may quote, because it's quite it's important, every citizen shall have the right and the opportunity to take part in elections as well as in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. We have the very same idea in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 21, which says, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, and that this will shall be expressed, again, in periodic and genuine elections. So, the idea of democracy is universally recognized, even by the national governments. And the essence that we can find in international law concerning democratic governance is that the will of the people should be expressed by genuine, free and fair, open elections. And now that we are moving into a globalized age, into the age of globalization, where we do in fact need global cooperation to face the global challenges that actually threaten the survival of human civilization at the planetary stage. If you look at climate change, for example, if we look at nuclear proliferation, for example, and many other issues that go into the direction of the vast development of technology, and biotechnology, genetics, and all that. Humanity is incapable of taking democratic decisions. The system is it's dysfunctional. And I believe that once we are able to introduce a democratic element into the system of global governance, we will also be in a position to make it more effective. Because only then it will have a legitimacy to actually take decisions that is today not happening. It's a very broad topic, but let me come to the issue of the UN Parliamentary Assembly, which is, in my view, the key. And it's I hope it should become clear by now that we are not talking about just some new UN institution. We are talking about the very first institution in the entire human history that would be mandated to represent us all as world citizens at the global level. Something that has never existed. Something that is changing the paradigm of international law completely. It is actually introducing a transition from international law with the idea that the international order is consisting of states only. It is transitioning to the idea of a global order that is actually respecting the equality of all world citizens. Because in international law, we don't exist as world citizens. We are not existing. There's always the intermediary through the governments. Well, so how democratic is this system? I mean, you have to imagine, if you look at the equality of world citizens, often the UN General Assembly is, referred to as the most universal, the most democratic body that exists. But if you look at it from the perspective of this paradigm change, then you will discover it's completely undemocratic, because it is possible to have 2/3 majority decisions for important decisions in the General Assembly that actually represent 8.4% of the world's population. So mathematically, of course, that's a question, but it underlines the point that you could have 2/3 majority decisions of a General Assembly that represents 8.4% of the world population. Is that a majority? Is that a 2/3 majority? Of course it's not. And that's one of the big problems in the intergovernmental system, that Tuvalu, with maybe 10,000 citizens, has the same weight, at least nominally, like China, with more than 1 billion. And this puts an imbalance into the system that makes it that's one of the reasons why it's dysfunctional. And in the UN Parliamentary Assembly, we would have, finally, not at the beginning, the idea of one person, one vote, meaning that there would be equal representation for all. That's the vision of a world parliament. And Josef Schwarzberg has been mentioned, thankfully. He has devised, like our committee, several methods how we can develop into that direction. One example one can draw upon is the European Parliament, that is using the system of digressive proportionality. This means that small countries have relatively more members of parliament than large countries. Like Malta, I believe they have, if I got the numbers right in the back of my head, like 80,000 citizens or voters per MEP, member of the European Parliament, and Germany has around 1 per 800,000. So you could say that Malta is 10 times better represented in the European Parliament than Germany. But this is a compromise that is required to actually establish transnational parliamentary representation. And it is also a solution to counter arguments at this stage, like, and I'm hearing that all the time, like, well, a world parliament would mean that Chinese and Indian members of parliament would actually take all decisions. But that's not right, for one, because we would have the system of digressive proportionality at the beginning, and then you have to imagine in a world parliament, not countries are represented, but parliamentarians. India would not be one block, but India would have a number of, depending on the model that is being used for the distribution of seats, it would have, let's say 100 MPs, and they wouldn't vote in a block. They would belong to transnational political groups that transcend national boundaries. Like, there would be a socialist group probably, a liberal group, conservative group, whatnot in a world parliament. And that's the thing, that it would be possible to come to more global-minded solutions. Of course, the idea of a world parliament is extremely complex, and it requires a lot of thinking. How could it be established? According to international law, how, and that's one of the most important questions we are still, struggling with. How do we convince governments to actually take this step? Because we will require a majority in the UN General Assembly, and thankfully I have to say that through the mandate by Mr. Desayas, for the first time since the establishment of the UN, there is now an opportunity, and it is being used by Mr. Desayas, thankfully, and there is now an opportunity to bring the idea into the system. And then I would like to close with the remark that this is not a new idea. We didn't invent it, and we don't, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. It's an idea that goes back to the French Revolution, actually. The idea of a democratic world parliament goes back to 1793, and it was for the first time expressis verbis put forward by, well, the French revolutionary Anacharsis Clotes, who had Prussian-Dutch roots. And you see, the time has come now that the world is globalizing, that human civilization is threatened, to actually implement this idea. And there's a lot of experience and expertise around, and civil society is, taking up the idea. And one sign for this is the growing traction of the campaign for UN parliamentaries. Thank you very much.